family is safe and protected and we're uplifted and can still make time for date night. Be oftentimes after school with him, helping with his antiques and watching.
For years, Thomas Markle and Doria Ragland appeared to exist on opposite sides of Meghan's complicated family story. But in this dramatized scenario, one buried detail suddenly brings their names together, and the secret they allegedly share threatens something far larger than a birthday. At first, the idea sounds almost impossible. Thomas and Doria have long represented two very different emotional worlds around Meghan, two separate histories, two separate loyalties. Yet suddenly, one old detail appears to connect them. Not a palace argument, not a wedding dispute, not another family betrayal. Something much older. Something that existed before Prince Harry, before royal titles, before cameras followed Meghan across continents. And according to the fictional claim now beginning to surface, it concerns the most basic fact imaginable: her age. But the number itself is not revealed immediately. That is what makes the story more unsettling. Thomas begins with fragments, memories that allegedly do not line up. Dates, he says, never made sense. Childhood milestones that seem to sit awkwardly beside the familiar timeline. Individually, each detail can be dismissed. Together, they begin to feel harder to ignore. Thomas becomes the first force pushing the story into dangerous territory. He suggests that what he remembers as a father is not completely reflected in the version the world later came to know. Yet even his claims are not the most powerful part of the mystery, because Thomas is emotional, outspoken, and already surrounded by family conflict. His words can be challenged. Doria is different. Her silence carries another kind of weight. She has rarely needed to dominate the public conversation, and that restraint makes the possibility of her confirming even one small detail far more explosive. If Thomas creates suspicion, Doria could give that suspicion gravity. And suddenly, the issue is no longer simply whether a birth year was recorded one way or another. The deeper question becomes why anyone would feel the need to protect a particular timeline at all. In ordinary life, an old family inconsistency might mean nothing. But royal life changes the value of personal information. Dates become biography. Biography becomes image. Image becomes trust. Then comes the first shadow of something more serious. An old family record, allegedly created long before Meghan entered royal circles, may contain the earliest contradiction. And Thomas may have only part of it, because the piece capable of changing everything may have remained with Doria. And once attention shifts from what Thomas claims to what Doria may have quietly preserved, the mystery stops looking like an angry father's accusation and begins to resemble something far more carefully buried. The first crack is not a confession. It is a date, a small, almost forgettable detail buried inside the fictional family timeline. Yet once that date is placed beside childhood milestones, school years, and old memories, the story begins producing questions nobody can easily explain away. The record itself does not look dramatic. There is no warning attached to it, no obvious sign that it could become the center of a family storm. It is simply an old fictional archival entry carrying a date that appears to sit awkwardly beside the timeline the public has long accepted. At first, that difference seems easy to dismiss. Records can be entered incorrectly. Memories can shift. Families can confuse years. But Thomas begins comparing the detail with everything he remembers. School periods, family moves, birthdays, childhood celebrations. Moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly become reference points in a much larger puzzle. According to this dramatized account, Thomas remembers certain events happening in one order, yet later paperwork appears to place them somewhere else. The more he compares the two versions, the less accidental the contradiction feels to him. That is where suspicion begins replacing confusion. Thomas allegedly starts asking whether the timeline was simplified years earlier, long before Meghan became internationally famous. But even he cannot say exactly why. Was the original date entered incorrectly? Was a later document mistaken? Did relatives simply repeat one version until it became accepted as fact? Or did someone make a deliberate choice that seemed harmless at the time? Years earlier, Thomas supposedly had little reason to care. Meghan was not connected to royalty. There were no palace biographies, no international headlines, no millions of people examining every detail of her past. A strange date inside old family history could remain exactly that, strange but irrelevant. Then another fictional clue appears. Thomas recalls an old family celebration that allegedly marked Meghan at an age that does not seem to match the later timeline. By itself, the memory proves nothing. But beside the archival date, it creates a second point of tension. And now, Doria's silence becomes harder to overlook. She was there during the earliest chapter of Meghan's life. If anyone could explain how the different dates emerged, it would be her. Which raises the question Thomas cannot answer. Who first benefited from keeping the timeline simple? But dates can be disputed, and memories can fade. What changes everything is the possibility that Doria remembers exactly what happened, and that her silence was never uncertainty at all. Doria's power in this fictional drama comes from what she does not say. While louder voices argue over dates and documents, her restraint creates a more unsettling possibility. Perhaps the person who knows the earliest version of Meghan's story has spent years deliberately refusing to correct it. Thomas, in this dramatized version of events, reacts to the mystery with frustration. He wants answers spoken clearly. He wants old memories compared openly with the dates that now appear inconsistent. Doria takes the opposite path. She does not rush to defend one version or attack another. She simply stays quiet. And that silence begins carrying more weight than any accusation Thomas could make. Because silence can mean many things. It can protect. It can conceal. It can preserve loyalty when telling the truth would create damage no one can reverse. For Doria, the conflict becomes deeply personal. Speaking might satisfy curiosity, but it could also expose something Meghan had lived with for years. Then comes the fictional private conversation that changes the emotional balance. According to the dramatized account, Doria is pressed about the conflicting timeline and gives only one guarded response. The familiar version was never the whole story. She offers no alternate age. No dramatic confession follows. Instead, those few words create an even larger mystery. Was she protecting Meghan? Protecting herself? Or protecting a decision made so long ago that nobody imagined it would someday matter beyond the family? That question becomes more dangerous once Meghan enters royal life. What had once been private history now sits beside official biographies, palace records, public profiles, and an institution obsessed with continuity. Suddenly, correcting an old inconsistency could create more suspicion than leaving it untouched. Doria's concern, in this fictional scenario, also reaches beyond Meghan. Harry is now part of the equation. Their children are part of it. Any controversy surrounding Meghan's identity could be dragged into arguments about the entire Sussex family. And somewhere before the wedding, an alleged conversation supposedly takes place, one in which the family realizes that palace staff have begun noticing small details that once seemed harmless. That is the moment Doria's silence changes meaning. It no longer looks passive, it looks deliberate. And that takes the story away from California family history and directly toward the palace gates, because according to the fictional timeline, questions began surfacing before Meghan ever walked down the aisle. Royal weddings are built on romance in public and paperwork in private. In this dramatized scenario, Meghan's background review allegedly uncovered a detail that senior aides could neither comfortably explain nor openly challenge, and suddenly, a family mystery became a palace management problem. By this point, the story has moved far beyond Thomas and Doria. Inside the fictional machinery of the monarchy, everything becomes more formal, colder, and harder to dismiss. Background files are checked. Public biographies are compared. Legal records, family details, earlier profiles, and published timelines are reviewed because royal life leaves very little room for uncertainty. Then one staff member allegedly notices something. Two pieces of historical information do not appear to sit comfortably together. It is not enough to prove wrongdoing. It may not even be important. But in an institution built around continuity, the smallest unexplained inconsistency can become dangerous if someone outside the palace discovers it first. That is the real concern, not Meghan's age itself. The greater fear is what happens if the public later believes officials knew about a conflicting detail and chose not to address it. Suddenly, an ordinary family irregularity could be turned into a story about concealment, credibility, and whether the palace protected a version of events it could not fully verify. In this fictional scenario, advisors divide quickly. Some argue that clarification is essential before the wedding. Others warn that asking deeper questions would be intrusive, unnecessary, and potentially explosive. Harry is said to react defensively. To him, yet another investigation into Meghan's life feels less like procedure and more like suspicion aimed at the woman he intends to marry. Meghan, meanwhile, allegedly insists that the inconsistency comes from complicated family history, not deliberate deception. But that explanation creates its own problem. Royal institutions prefer clean answers. Complicated private histories do not fit easily into carefully managed public biographies. Then an internal note allegedly appears. It does not accuse Meghan of lying. It does not name an alternate age. It simply marks one portion of the timeline as requiring clarification. That phrase becomes crucial, because according to this dramatized version, when the background material is reviewed again later, the note is gone. No explanation, no visible correction, just absence. And once something disappears, people stop asking only what it said. They start asking who removed it. A questionable date might have remained an internal curiosity forever, until someone allegedly removed the question itself, turning an awkward discrepancy into the appearance of a secret. The most dangerous moment in a scandal is often not the original mistake. It is the moment somebody appears to tidy it away. In this fictional account, an early palace reference to Meghan's timeline allegedly disappears, and suddenly everyone wants to know who ordered the change. The earlier draft, according to this dramatized version, contains nothing explosive on its face. No accusation. No declaration that Meghan had deliberately misled anyone. Only a quiet question, attached to one part of her personal history. A request for clarification that seems almost routine. Then the final version appears. The question is gone. That single absence changes the entire mood of the story. Was it Meghan's team trying to prevent an irrelevant family issue from becoming gossip? Did royal communications staff decide the note served no useful purpose? Did lawyers advise that an unverified discrepancy should never have been included? Or did an editor simply remove a confusing detail while preparing a cleaner file? Any of those explanations could be ordinary. But once people begin believing something was deliberately erased, ordinary explanations stop feeling ordinary. Thomas hears rumors that palace staff had supposedly questioned the same timeline he had been challenging privately. For him, the reaction is immediate. Vindication mixes with bitterness. The memories people dismissed as anger now appear, in his mind, to have been echoed by royal paperwork. And that makes him more determined. Doria reacts differently. In this fictional scenario, she understands something Thomas does not fully appreciate. Whatever happened began long before Meghan became an actress, long before Harry, and long before Buckingham Palace had any reason to know her name. The original decision, she allegedly believes, was personal. Not royal strategy, not ambition, not some elaborate plan for future fame. A family choice. Perhaps one made during a difficult period, when simplifying a date seemed harmless because nobody imagined millions of strangers would someday examine it. But time changes harmless decisions. Correcting the record years later could create accusations of deception. Leaving it alone could make the eventual discovery look even worse. What once protected privacy now threatens trust. Thomas, however, is no longer willing to protect the silence. According to this fictional account, he gives Meghan an ultimatum. Address the contradiction herself, or he will reveal the exact age discrepancy publicly. That threat changes the balance completely, because once Thomas decides the number itself should be spoken aloud, Doria faces a choice she has avoided for decades. Then comes the moment the fictional story has been building toward. Thomas stops speaking in riddles and claims Meghan is older than the accepted timeline suggests. But before the accusation can become the entire story, Doria allegedly reveals something even more powerful, the reason the confusion began. For Thomas, the disclosure is not delivered with triumph alone. In this dramatized version, anger sits beside regret. He wants to prove that the memories he defended were not invented, yet he also understands that once the claim is spoken publicly, it cannot be pulled back. He alleges a meaningful gap between the familiar timeline and what he remembers from Meghan's earliest years. But Doria immediately complicates the accusation. According to the fictional account, she insists the story did not begin with royalty, fame, or some calculated plan to mislead the world. It began during a difficult period inside the family, when dates, paperwork, and personal circumstances were far less orderly than they later appeared. Her explanation changes the emotional weight of everything. What looks sinister from the outside may have started as something small, a clerical mistake, a simplified family detail, or a private adjustment nobody expected to matter years later. Once repeated, however, the version allegedly became fixed. Forms copied forms. Biographies copied earlier biographies. Eventually, what may have begun as confusion hardened into identity. That places Meghan in the most painful position. If she corrected the story years later, critics could accuse her of admitting deception. If she stayed silent, they could claim she knowingly protected an inaccurate version. Even if she inherited the confusion rather than created it, the consequences would still fall on her. Harry, in this fictional scenario, reacts with fury. To him, Thomas has taken something rooted in Meghan's childhood and turned it into a weapon. The family disagreement is no longer private. It has become international speculation, and the palace now has its own impossible choice. Deny Thomas and risk another contradictory record surfacing. Say nothing and allow suspicion to grow. But the public conversation is already shifting. The age itself begins to matter less than what people think it could touch. Official biographies, royal status, family records, and eventually questions about inheritance. Because the instant the alleged discrepancy becomes public, the question changes from "How old is Meghan?" to something far more explosive. Could any part of the royal record be affected? A birthday should be personal. Inside a monarchy, however, every recorded detail can become attached to titles, ceremonies, biographies, public trust, and succession mythology. The fictional scandal now expands beyond Meghan herself, raising questions far more dramatic than the original family disagreement. At this stage, the controversy is no longer being treated as celebrity gossip. The deeper issue becomes credibility. Not because a different age would suddenly rewrite hereditary succession, but because people begin asking whether the palace relied on information it never fully verified. That distinction matters. In this dramatized scenario, critics seize on the discrepancy as proof that royal vetting failed. They argue that if one basic biographical detail could remain uncertain, what else might have passed without question? Supporters fire back just as quickly. Meghan is an adult woman, they argue, and her age has no constitutional power. Turning a private family complication into a national scandal feels invasive, unnecessary, and cruel. But the argument does not stop there. Attention shifts toward official biographies. Should they be corrected if conflicting material exists? Should the palace acknowledge uncertainty? Or would any change only make the story look more suspicious? Those questions connect to frustrations already surrounding titles, public money, privacy, and royal transparency. Suddenly, a family date becomes symbolic of something much larger. How much truth the monarchy owes the public, and where personal history is allowed to remain private. Harry, in this fictional account, becomes furious. What began as an argument about Meghan is now being stretched toward his children, their place in the royal family, and questions he considers deeply personal. Doria begins regretting that she spoke at all. Her explanation was meant to reduce suspicion. Instead, it gives the controversy new life. Even Thomas begins to understand that exposing the alleged discrepancy may have consequences he never intended. Vindication no longer feels simple when every revelation creates another question. Then the darkest twist arrives. A fictional document connected to inheritance or family identity allegedly carries the same disputed date. That changes everything. Now the issue cannot be dismissed as a confused interview, an unreliable memory, or an old biography copied incorrectly. There is another piece of paperwork, and it appears to pull the mystery into territory far more sensitive than anyone expected. And with that document, the controversy finally reaches the one subject royal families fear more than embarrassment: inheritance, legitimacy, and the ownership of a name. By now, the fictional mystery has moved far beyond candles on a birthday cake. The disputed number becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is who controlled the story, who stayed silent, who benefited from certainty, and why correcting one old detail eventually became more dangerous than protecting it. For Meghan, the pressure is no longer about a date. It is about identity. She has lived as a daughter, an actress, a duchess, a wife, a mother, and one of the most watched women in the world. Each version of her life carries its own expectations, and now those versions are being pulled together by a question she may never have wanted to answer publicly. Thomas sees disclosure as truth. In his mind, silence allowed confusion to grow. Doria sees it differently. To her, truth without context can become another kind of distortion. And Meghan, in this dramatized account, sees something else entirely: privacy. She believes neither parent has the right to hand over pieces of her personal history simply because the world demands them. Harry understands that instinct immediately. His anger is shaped by years of believing that private pain becomes public property the moment outsiders decide they are entitled to it. Inside the palace, however, emotion matters less than precedent. If one official biography can be challenged, then every previous statement becomes vulnerable to fresh inspection. Dates, interviews, profiles, family claims, everything can be reopened. That is what fame does. It turns small inconsistencies into weapons. And Meghan has inherited more than a family story. She has inherited the unresolved tension between two parents who cannot agree on what truth requires. The monarchy's deeper fear, therefore, is not an alternate birth date. It is the possibility that its polished public narratives can be cracked open by private records no institution fully controls. Then Thomas and Doria begin drifting apart again. Their brief alignment collapses over one final question. Should everything be revealed? Thomas says yes. Doria hesitates. And Meghan says nothing. Because, according to the fictional story, one final piece of information remains withheld, something neither parent can confirm alone. And that leaves the story exactly where neither Thomas nor Doria can finish it, at Meghan's door, with one final question only she could answer. After all the allegations, conflicting memories, palace anxiety, and family anger, the fictional story arrives at an unexpected ending. Meghan does not provide the dramatic confession everyone demands. Instead, her refusal forces the public to confront why one disputed number became powerful enough to tear through an entire family. For critics, the silence looks suspicious. They argue that a simple answer could end the speculation in seconds. Supporters see something completely different. To them, refusing to participate is an act of dignity, a rejection of the idea that every private detail must be surrendered simply because the public is curious. Those closest to Meghan may see a third possibility: exhaustion. Because by now, the fictional controversy is no longer about proving one date right or wrong. It has become a fight over who gets to define her history. Thomas interprets the silence as confirmation of everything he has claimed. In his mind, Meghan's refusal to answer only strengthens the case he has been trying to make. Doria rejects that conclusion entirely. Silence, she argues, proves nothing. If anything, it shows how impossible the situation has become. Harry draws the hardest line. In this dramatized scenario, he refuses to let the debate expand further into his marriage or his children. No explanations, no negotiations, no family details offered to satisfy strangers. The palace chooses restraint as well, declining to engage deeply with disputed claims rooted in private family history. But every person involved has already paid a price. Thomas may have proved, at least to himself, that his memories mattered. Yet that victory could cost him whatever possibility of reconciliation remained. Doria loses the protection that came with saying almost nothing. Once she speaks, even carefully, every word becomes evidence for somebody. Meghan pays differently. Her life story is no longer treated as something she owns. It becomes a public file, something people feel entitled to examine, challenge, and rewrite. And perhaps that is where the fictional mystery truly ends, not with a number, but with a question of ownership. When fame turns private history into entertainment, who gets to decide what remains personal? In the end, Thomas may have supplied the accusation, and Doria may have supplied the missing context, but neither could control what happened once the secret escaped the family. Because the most dangerous thing about a hidden date was never the number itself. It was everything people were prepared to believe had been hidden with it.